My name is Claire Parker, and I'm 17 years old. We had a substitute teacher, an older guy, probably mid-50s. He wasn't particularly strange at first, just the usual dry, half-interested demeanor that most subs had. He read from a lesson plan, assigned some work, then sat at the desk scrolling through his phone. It wasn't until halfway through class that I realized he kept looking up at me. Not in an obvious way, but every time I glanced up from my notebook, I caught him shifting his eyes away. I ignored it. Maybe I was imagining things. With 10 minutes left in class, he stood up and walked around the room, stopping at different desks to check on our work. When he got to me, he lingered a little too long, his fingers tapping on my desk as he pretended to look over my answers. Then he murmured something I couldn't hear, so I asked, "What?" He smiled. "You remind me of someone I used to know." That made me uneasy, but I just forced a polite laugh and went back to my work. When the bell rang, I packed up and left as quickly as I could. The next class was study hall in the library, and I took my usual seat near the back. About 10 minutes in, I felt the air shift behind me. Someone had walked up close. I turned, and there he was, the sub. "What are you working on?" he asked. I lied and said I was studying for a test. He nodded slowly like he didn't believe me, then stepped away. But as he left, he lightly tapped the back of my chair. For the rest of the period, I felt off. Not scared exactly, just unsettled. When the last bell rang, I took my time packing up, letting most of the students leave ahead of me. As I walked toward the hallway, I saw him again, standing by the main entrance, arms crossed, like he was waiting for someone. I pretended not to see him and ducked into the restroom instead. The school was almost empty now. I waited a few minutes, then peeked out into the hallway. He was gone. Relieved, I started toward the back doors to head home. The hallway was silent, my footsteps echoing. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a quiet, deliberate click. The lights went out. I froze. The only illumination was from the fading daylight bleeding in through the small square windows on the doors. I took a breath, trying to stay calm, but my body was already reacting. Then, in the dim light, I saw movement. A shape at the end of the hallway. It was him. He was standing still, barely visible. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted for the doors, shoving them open and bursting into the cool evening air. I ran across the lot, down the sidewalk, not slowing until I reached my street. By the time I got home, I was out of breath, my hands shaking. I never told anyone, not my parents, not my friends. I didn't even know what to say. The next day, the regular teacher was back. The sub was gone, and no one ever mentioned him again. When I was in high school, I worked as a student aide in the library. It was an easy gig, mostly shelving books and watching the clock. The library had 2 levels, the main floor, where everyone studied, and the basement, which held old books, broken chairs, and stuff nobody cared about. It was always quiet down there, and the lighting was terrible. Most students didn't even know it existed. One afternoon, Miss Carter, the librarian, asked me to retrieve a box of outdated reference books from the basement. I didn't mind. It gave me an excuse to be away from the front desk. I grabbed the keys, unlocked the heavy metal door, and descended the stairs. It smelled musty, like old paper and dust. Rows of shelves lined the room, some covered with sheets like forgotten furniture in an abandoned house. I found the box near the back wall, but just as I picked it up, the overhead lights flickered and shut off completely. The entire basement went pitch black. I pulled out my phone, but there was barely any signal. No flashlight either. Just the faint glow of the screen. I waited, assuming it was some electrical issue. But then I heard something. A shuffle. It came from somewhere between the shelves. I turned off my phone screen, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone else come down. "Miss Carter," I whispered. Nothing, just silence. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving closer. I swallowed hard. My brain tried to rationalize it. A janitor, maybe. But why wouldn't they say anything? The steps stopped just a few feet away, hidden by the darkness. Then I heard it. Something dragging across the floor like a heavy object being pulled. Then breathing. Not normal breathing. Shaky, uneven gasps, like someone struggling to contain their excitement. I pressed my back against the shelves, trying to make myself smaller. The silence stretched unbearably, and then suddenly a whisper, hoarse, playful, right in front of me, calling me by my name. I felt creeped out. I turned on my phone screen for just a second. The glow barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to see a shape crouched between the shelves, low, motionless. I didn't think, I just ran, slamming into bookshelves in the dark, knocking over piles of dusty books. I reached the door, yanked it open, and stumbled into the main floor of the library. The warm overhead lights felt unreal after the darkness below. Ms. Carter glanced up from her desk, raising an eyebrow. "You all right?" I turned back to the basement door, but no one came out. No sound followed. When I told Ms. Carter what happened, she frowned. No one else was scheduled to be down there. She walked over, flicked the basement lights on, and called down the stairs. But nothing was in the basement. When security checked later, they found a single shelf completely cleared, books scattered across the floor like someone had crawled between them. But the cameras, they only showed me going in. And to this day, I never went down there alone. It started as a dumb dare, sneaking into our old high school's abandoned west wing, the part of the building that had been sealed off for years. Nobody really talked about why it was closed. Some said it was due to asbestos. Others whispered about an incident that got covered up. Either way, we wanted to see for ourselves. There was an old maintenance tunnel that led into the basement, hidden behind a rusted fence on the side of the school. We knew about it because Tyler's older brother used to work janitorial shifts before he graduated. The tunnel entrance was a metal door with a broken padlock, hanging open just enough for us to slip through one by one. Inside, the air was thick, damp, and smelled of rot. Dim emergency lights buzzed along the ceiling, casting eerie shadows as we crept forward. The deeper we went, the quieter everything felt, like the walls were swallowing sound. We finally reached the basement of the West Wing. It was worse than we imagined. Storage boxes stacked haphazardly, old desks covered in graffiti, and a few overturned chairs. The worst part, the unnatural stillness. It felt like the whole place was waiting. Then we heard it, footsteps. We all stopped to listen. The sound was moving somewhere beyond the stacked boxes. It didn't sound like a janitor. It was too careful. Like whoever was walking didn't want to be heard, but also didn't mind if they were. Tyler pointed ahead. A door, probably, led to the upper floors. "Let's go," he mouthed, and we moved in sync, keeping low. As we pushed through the door, we found ourselves in a long, pitch-black hallway. The air was colder here, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The exit signs barely glowed red, and the lockers lining the walls were dented and scratched. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The lockers. Some of them had marks, long, jagged scratches, as if something had clawed at them. Others had words scrawled in red. At first I thought it was graffiti, but as I stared I realized it was the same phrase, repeated over and over. "Don't open the doors." I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Tyler. His face had a scared expression. He motioned toward the far end of the hall, a single door, and from the crack the faintest sliver of light seeped through. Then the whispers started. They were soft, nearly imperceptible, like someone murmuring from far away. But they weren't coming from the door. They were coming from the lockers. I stepped closer, heart hammering, my breath fogged in the cold air as I pressed an ear against one of the locker doors. A faint voice, hoarse, desperate. "Help me!" I stumbled back. Tyler grabbed my arm, shaking his head. "We need to go." Now but Josh was already pushing the door open. The room beyond was bathed in the flickering glow of an old CRT television, sitting in the middle of an otherwise empty classroom. The screen was full of static, crackling like distant whispers. Josh took a step inside. Then the TV cut to black. We heard footsteps coming toward us from the hallway. We didn't wait. Grabbing Josh, we sprinted back the way we came, crashing through the basement door, down the tunnels, and out into the night air. As we turned back, we saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the threshold of the tunnel, watching us. Tall. Its face was nothing but darkness. The next day, Tyler checked the West Wing. Still sealed. No maintenance tunnel, no way in. In 2019, I moved into a small apartment near my university. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom unit on the second floor of an old complex. The place was cheap, which should have been a red flag. But as a broke college student, I didn't have the luxury of being picky. It had character, as people like to say when something is just old. faded wallpaper, uneven floors, and a draft that never went away, no matter how many times I checked the windows. The first night, as I was unpacking, I heard something strange. A faint whisper. Not words, just the sound of breath slipping through barely parted lips. I froze, listening. It was so quiet that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But the longer I stood there, the more certain I became. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the floor. I tried to shake it off. Old buildings make weird noises. Creaking pipes, shifting wood. Nothing unusual. But over the next few nights, the whispering continued. Always around 3 a.m. Faint, drawn-out breaths slipping through the cracks between the floorboards beneath my bed. At first, I ignored it. I told myself it was just the way the building settled. But the more I listened, the more I swore the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like something trying to form words. One night, I decided to record it. I placed my phone on the floor, hit record, and waited. The whispering came, soft and insistent. After a minute, I stopped the recording and played it back. Nothing. Just static. That should have been the end of it, but instead it made everything worse. The next night, I woke up gasping. I had been dreaming, no, feeling, like someone was standing over me. The sensation was so real that my entire body seized up before I even opened my eyes. When I finally did, the room was empty, but something felt off. Then I noticed my rug. It had shifted. Not just a little, completely flipped back, exposing the wood beneath. My stomach dropped. My hands shook as I reached down and pulled the rug away completely. The floor was scratched. Long, uneven gouges stretched across the wood, as if someone, or something, had been clawing at it. And then I saw something that sent ice down my spine. Between the wooden planks, through the thin, splintered cracks, there was an eye, wide, unblinking, staring up at me from beneath the floor. I screamed and jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My breath came in sharp gasps as I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking as I turned on the flashlight. But when I shined it on the floor, there was nothing, no scratches, no gaps, no eye, just solid wood. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I had seen it. I knew I had. But the floor looked completely untouched. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning I called my landlord. I told him something was wrong with the apartment, that I wanted to break my lease. He didn't even argue, just sighed and said, "You lasted longer than most." His words made my skin crawl. I demanded to know what he meant, and after a long silence, he finally told me. Years ago, a woman who lived in my unit had gone missing. Months later, they found her body, beneath the floorboards, right under where my bed had been. No one ever figured out how she got there, or who put her there. That was all I needed to hear. I packed my things and left that same day. This happened during my freshman year in college. I lived on the 4th floor of a co-ed dorm, one of the older buildings on campus. It had a long, dimly lit hallway with creaky floors and an outdated security system that barely worked. At first, everything was normal. I had a few friends in my classes and got along well with my roommate. But there was one person I kept seeing, too often for it to be a coincidence. He was tall, lanky, with shaggy blonde hair that always seemed slightly damp, like he had just stepped out of a shower. He lived somewhere down the hall, but I never saw him talking to anyone. It started subtly. I'd see him leaving his room just as I was heading to class. Then I'd catch him sitting alone in the dining hall at a table near mine. I even spotted him in the campus library once, staring blankly at his laptop screen without typing anything. It was weird, but I told myself it was just chance. Then, one evening, things escalated. I had just come back from a late study session and was unlocking my door when I felt it, that prickling sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and there he was, standing at the far end of the hallway, his gaze fixed on me. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I rushed inside, locked the door, and tried to shake off the unease. A few nights later, my roommate was gone for the weekend. I was alone, studying at my desk when I heard something faint, a slow, deliberate knocking. It was coming from the other side of my door. I froze. It wasn't a knock, just tapping. I crept toward the peephole, but before I could look, the handle jiggled. Someone was testing if the door was locked. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away. After a moment, the jiggling stopped, silence. I stayed up all night, too afraid to sleep. The next morning, I left my room cautiously, scanning the hallway. No one was there. A few days passed, and I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just exhausted from studying too much. But then came the worst night of all. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up suddenly, feeling off. The air in my room was still, but something was wrong. That's when I noticed it. My closet door, which had been shut when I went to bed, was open, like someone had been peeking out. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. My phone was on my nightstand, but I didn't dare reach for it. My breath felt too loud. I stared at the dark gap in the closet, expecting something to happen. Then, barely audible, I heard it. Something was moving inside the closet. I acted on instinct. I lunged for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it at the closet. But it was empty. But something was off. My clothes had been pushed to the side. The small crawl space behind them, one I had never used, was slightly open. I ran. I bolted out of my room, down the hallway, and straight to the RA's room, banging on his door until he woke up. Security was called, and when they checked my room, they found something that still makes my skin crawl. Inside the crawl space, there was a small blanket, a half-empty bottle of water, and a notebook. The notebook was filled with pages and pages of scribbled notes about me. What time I left for class, what time I went to sleep, what I wore on different days, and one sentence written over and over: "She doesn't know yet." Campus security identified the guy, blonde hair. He had a key to my room. Apparently, he had stolen the master key from a janitor's closet weeks ago. He had been sneaking in, hiding, watching me. He was expelled, arrested. I never saw him again, but to this day I sleep with my closet door shut and triple-check my locks, because I'll never forget that night. I was a new student, starting my junior year without knowing a soul. Everyone had their groups, their established friendships. The worst part was lunchtime. My school required juniors to stay on campus, so I had to eat in the cafeteria. I dreaded it, knowing I'd have no one to sit with, and forcing my way into a random table seemed awkward. When lunchtime arrived, I walked in with my tray, scanning for an empty spot. Almost every table was full. But there was one in the farthest corner with only 2 students sitting there, a guy and a girl, both dressed in dark clothes, whispering to each other. It was my best option, so I walked over and asked if I could sit. They exchanged glances. Then the girl told me to sit. As I sat, I noticed something odd about them. They both had friendly tone, and while talking to me, their eyes stayed on me in a creepy way. They introduced themselves as Eli and June. They weren't exactly warm, but they talked to me. They even invited me to hang out after school. I figured, why not? It was better than being alone. After school, I got a text from Eli. He told me they had a secret spot they hung out at, an abandoned house a few blocks away, near the woods. He said it was the perfect place, and some of their friends were having a party there. That should have been my first red flag, but I was desperate for friends, so I agreed. By 9 p.m., I was on my way there. The house was barely standing, its windows boarded up, its front door slightly ajar. My phone buzzed. It was June. "Come inside. We're upstairs." The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of rot and mildew. I used my flashlight to find my way up the creaky stairs. Eli, June. My voice cut through the stillness, but no one answered. Then soft footsteps coming from the hall ahead. My phone buzzed again. A text from Eli: "We see you." A chill ran through me. My flashlight flickered. In that brief moment of darkness, I heard whispering, low, almost guttural. I spun around, pointing the dim beam of light down the hallway. 2 figures stood at the end of it. Eli and June, but they were different. Their skin looked black, their eyes completely red, their mouths twisted into eerie smiles. I took a step back, my gut screamed at me to run. The whispering got louder, but neither of them moved. Then, without warning, they lunged. I turned and sprinted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my panic. As I burst through the front door, I felt something claw at my shirt. I yanked free and ran all the way home, heart pounding. I locked my bedroom door that night, trying to convince myself it was a prank. But just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone buzzed. A picture message. It was a photo of my bedroom window, from outside. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They called the school, but when we checked the records, there were no students named Eli or June. Also, there were no texts or messages in my account from any number. I don't know who I met that night, but sometimes I still wake up to the sound of whispering just outside my window.